As the Ukrainian army continues to wipe out enemy troops from the map one by one, Ukraine now looks more determined than ever in all-out combat. With the victory in Kherson, the Ukrainian warriors were emboldened and remain the worst nightmare of the Russian army. It is said that the morale of the Russian army collapsed in the face of these attacks of the Ukrainian heroes who fought until the end for the freedom of their country. Vladimir Putin humiliates himself in every statement he makes, and his nervousness and uneasiness are evident on his face. While the Ukrainian armed forces is pushing back the Russian army from all directions in the Donbas region, Russian troops playing their last trump damage the civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, leaving the Ukrainian citizens without electricity and fuel. Trying to change the course of the war in this way in the approaching winter conditions, the Russians reveal their desperation by showing us the ugliest face of the war. All Russian troops, including elite soldiers trusted by the Russian army in Donbas, have started revolts against Putin. While the Kremlin was struggling to find volunteers for the Ukrainian fronts, Putin came to the level of giving serious financial incentive to the volunteers to be sent to the Ukrainian front as cannon fodder. The pro-Russian militias, which declared themselves Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, rebelled against Putin and refused to fight in the Donetsk region. The situation is so critical that it seems impossible for Putin not to be aware of the approaching sad end. Together, we observe the heavy collapse of the Russian soldiers psychologically. Especially heavy weather conditions push them to a complete thaw. The all-out counterattack of the Ukrainian armed forces, which started with lightning speed in the Kherson region, completely collapsed the Russian troops. As a result of the operations carried out by the Ukrainian artillery, air force and special operations forces, the Russian soldiers in Kherson rebelled against Putin's orders and surrendered. Putin's soldiers' white flag waving in front of the heroes of Ukraine fell like a bomb on the agenda. Putin's face turned red as shocking images released by Ukraine's Southern Operation Command insulted the Russian army. Zelensky's fighters dealt a heavy blow to the advance of the Ukrainian invasion of the Russian front troops in the Kherson region, crushing the Russian army in this region with his heavy fist and waving the white flag to the invaders. Video taken from Ukrainian drone shows Russian soldiers waving a white flag on armored vehicles, begging for their lives and to escape the bombardments of Ukrainian forces. It is said that Russian commanders even resort to email to encourage new volunteers. Ammunition and other resources began to run out on the battlefront. Putin's army suffered heavy losses in the face of the brave resistance of Ukrainian fighters. The equipment crisis that has been experienced in the Russian army since almost the first day of the war brings with it much more serious consequences. The arrival of winter and the presence of some areas where the weather reaches almost -20 degrees wipes away the last shred of courage in the hearts of the soldiers of the Russian army. On the other hand, with the aid sent from the west to the Ukrainian armed forces, they stand much more prepared for the winter. It seems that the Ukrainians will gradually receive the reward of resistance, which does not fall on the world agenda. It is estimated that approximately 50,000 Russian soldiers have been killed since February 24th, when the invasion began. Russia, on the other hand, keeps these figures a secret. But the Russians, who are aware of everything, are in a state of moral collapse, although they keep some facts hidden. There is only one point that this trend points to: the increasing dissatisfaction of the Russians with the Kremlin, the psychological and physiological collapse of the Russian soldiers, and the depletion of resources on the battlefields are bringing Putin closer to this point step by step. Actually, there's a hidden truth behind this aggressive attitude of Russia. Putin is dragging his country into the swamp, both diplomatically and economically. This advance destroyed almost all of Russia's possibilities for the next 30 years. As long as Putin's aggressive and thoughtless attitude continues, it is possible that he will be overthrown and Russia will collapse seriously. The Russian people have also hung their rebel flags. The high inflation in the country and the shrinkage in the economy have disturbed the people quite a lot. Especially the Russian elite, the big names of the business world, are not happy with this war. They say that their standard of living has been turned upside down and their wealth is gone. In addition, well-known world giant brands began to withdraw from Russia. In addition, Vladimir Putin started an energy war with Europe while fighting with Ukraine. Putin, who cut off most of Europe's gas, was initially thought to be in power. However, at the current point, it seems that he will lose this war as well. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the situation for the country's energy sector is deplorable. Russia has turned its energy supply into an economic weapon. The strategy is clear in Ukraine, where Russian drones and missiles bombard power plants. But this is also seen in Europe, where Moscow has turned off the gas taps and possibly blew up a pipeline. However, Russian President Vladimir Putin's master plan now seems to backfire. In the short term, Putin will indeed cause economic damage to the countries of the European Union. That much is inevitable. But in the long run, Russia cannot win this energy war. Putin's maneuver will only speed up the collapse of his country's energy sector and the loss of its coveted status as a global energy superpower. Russia's weaponization of energy has three goals. First, with the gas taps more or less open, was to create uncertainty and prevent EU countries from preparing for what was to come. The second goal was to devastate European economies. And on that front, Russia's strategy is working. The Eurozone will likely record a recession next year. Meanwhile, Putin's third goal was to fuel political divisions in Europe by spreading the idea that the sanctions were causing the energy crisis. This, of course, is a reversal of cause and effect. It was Russia's decision to invade Ukraine that caused this crisis. However, the narrative has received some attention in the EU. In the short term, Europe is in a difficult stalemate. An economic and social crisis is escalating as high energy prices fuel inflation and a cost of living crisis that could possibly last 2 or 3 years. Also, things could be much worse than they are now. A particularly cold winter will increase energy demand and make congestion worse. The situation may become even more dire in the winter, as European countries manage to refill their gas tanks while Russian gas continues to flow up and down this summer. But they may not be able to do so before the winter. Obviously, it cannot be denied that these are tough times for the EU, but the fact that Putin's strategy is doomed to backfire may offer some consolation. Moscow's blackmail has firmly convinced EU countries that Moscow is not a reliable energy supplier. As a result, Europe is redoubling its efforts to rid itself of its dependence on Russian hydrocarbons, with LNG infrastructure being rapidly built to boost imports from the US, Australia, and Qatar. The first of many new LNG terminals will soon open in Estonia, Latvia, and Finland, with new gas contracts being negotiated to increase supplies, for example from Algeria or Norway. Bloc is also accelerating plans to develop renewable energy sources. Therefore, it seems that in about 3 years, Europe will no longer need Russian oil and gas. Just 2 months from now, the bloc will stop nearly all imports of Russian oil and will require Russian oil companies to find alternative buyers for Russian crude. This shouldn't be too difficult as demand from China, India, and some other developing countries is still high. But these countries will not be perfect substitutes for the European market, once Russia's largest buyer of hydrocarbons, because they will now expect massive reductions in the price of Russian crude oil. In addition, the United States may begin to impose secondary sanctions on Russia's oil exports, further restricting Russian sales. Meanwhile, the Kremlin's situation looks even worse when it comes to gas. Russia currently exports its gas through pipelines positioned to serve Europe, and building new pipelines in their place will take time and money, both of which are insufficient. Exporting gas via pipeline also means signing new contracts with willing buyers. And here, again, things look tough for Moscow, as China is currently the only country capable of absorbing more Russian gas, but Beijing is in no hurry to comply. This is not a surprise. China's gas demand growth has slowed, and Russia has made it clear that it is not a reliable energy supplier. This is something Chinese leaders will not forget, and they will naturally try to avoid dependence on Russian gas. With all this in mind, it would not be an exaggeration to say that the situation is dire for the Russian energy sector, which represents 1/3 of the country's economy, about half of its financial income, and roughly 2/3 of its exports. Recent estimates from the International Energy Agency assume that Russia's annual revenue from energy exports will fall by more than half by 2030, from $75 billion to $35 billion before the war in Ukraine begins. This monetary destruction is seen as one of the biggest stakes Putin has thrown at his country. Because of the sanctions, Russian energy companies no longer have access to Western finance and technology. For the Kremlin, this is an existential threat. Existing energy fields are slowly depleting their reserves, And although there are new fields in the Arctic, developing them will require huge sums of money and top-notch Western technology. Without access to both, Russia's energy production will slowly decline over the coming decades. Combined with falling demand for fossil fuels as the world transitions to renewable energy, all this means that the energy war that Putin himself started can only end badly for Russia. While Putin was trying to suffocate Europe with cold, he made moves that would shatter his own economy. In the end, he destroyed his country's future, just as it would at the end of the Ukrainian war. If this process continues with Putin, much more difficult days await the Russian people. Thanks for watching us. Stay cool.